Hello, and welcome to the last episode of this set of installments of the virtual ICL webinar series, Intercultural Learning and Inclusive Teaching for the New Virtual Paradigm, brought to you by the Center for Intercultural Learning, Mentorship, Assessment, and Research at Purdue University. I'm Annette Benson. This series has been brought to you every other week of the spring and summer of 2020, as we have together negotiated the new realities of COVID-19 and what it means for study abroad and virtual intercultural learning. With the start of the school year, the webinar series will be going on hiatus. In the first half of our webinar series, SILMAR has been focusing on putting intercultural learning into the distance learning environment as COVID-19 caused quick pivots in study abroad plans. In the second half of the series, we've turned our attention toward creating classrooms, both face-to-face and through distance learning, which are inclusive. You're welcome to use the chat function to input your questions at any time during the presentation. And with that, let's get started.
Hello, I'm Dr. Chris Atchison-Clare, Director of SILMAR, and I'm very pleased to be here with you today and hosting our finale for our 2020 webinar series, and especially to be introducing to you Dr. Shalise Eisminger, who is our presenter today. Shalise is the perfect person to talk to you about this topic, which is really focusing on why platforms matter and why who students are matters and their experiences in different platforms, whether we're talking about face-to-face or online instruction. So hopefully this topic will really resonate with you as we move into yet another semester where our lives as academics are rather disrupted and we may be relying on online environments more than what is our normal reality. So a little bit about Dr. Eisminger. She received her PhD in curriculum instruction here at Purdue in 2018, and since then she's been working as a postdoc in the College of Agriculture's Office of Multicultural Programs. Part of her work in that postdoc was to collaborate with SILMAR staff in analyzing data that came out of a course that Dr. Morris, the Assistant Dean of Multicultural Programs in the College of Agriculture, has been teaching for many years now. It's AGR 201, Communicating Across Cultures. And Shalise herself has been teaching this class for a number of years, actually since 2012, the entire time that she was a graduate student at Purdue. So she's got lots of experience in teaching the course, but also in working with the learning outcomes data from this course. And so she's just the perfect person to describe to you what we've discovered over the years in terms of the interactions between who students are and how they experience the curriculum in AGR 201. So with that said, I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Shalise Eisminger.
Hello, my name is Shalise Eisminger, and I will be presenting to you about some data that we collected using the Beliefs, Events, and Values Inventory, or the BEVI, on a course called AGR 201, Communicating Across Cultures. It's taught in the College of Ag. So this presentation is called Comparing the Effects of Social Identities on Student Learning Outcome Attainment, looking at the face-to-face context versus the online context. So we're comparing student learning outcome attainment based on their identities in the face-to-face versus online course. As far as justification for this study, research supports the need for undergraduate students to have opportunities to experiences to critically examine their own cultural and social groups as well as other cultural and social groups, and then paying attention as well to groups that have been historically marginalized or disregarded in the curriculum, so groups that they may not have learned about growing up. And we have the ability to address deeply held beliefs, prejudices, and appropriate assumptions that we've picked up over time through many ways, but one of those ways are courses. Courses that use frameworks such as intercultural competence, transformative learning, and or social justice provide those types of opportunities. As far as significance of the study goes, looking at comparing face-to-face and online course offerings have been increasing in higher education. However, within the current climate of COVID-19, it's increasing at a larger scope as well as a faster pace than previously expected, at least for the time being, especially with some classes only offering classes virtually and online in this fall semester. So the purpose of this study, Deardorff, who is one of the major names in intercultural competence literature, she posed the question, what roles do personal traits, self-schema, emotions, and motives play in intercultural competence development and assessment? We completed a study that got published this year that contributed to the literature addressing this question. So we used the bevy to look at the effects of country of origin, gender, ethnicity, political affiliation, and religiosity, how those were salient or not salient aspects of students' identities in relation to their experience in the AGR 201 course, which is a multicultural curriculum. So this study that we're looking at now, or the data we're looking at now, is kind of like a follow-up or moment to move forward really with the work that we've already done and the data we've already collected. Now looking at how those identities affect students in both online and face-to-face contexts. So the previous study mentioned there was only in the face-to-face context. So this is looking at the same course, but in the online and face-to-face formats. A little bit more about the Communicating Across Cultures course. So it is a course that's offered in the College of Agriculture. It fulfills the multicultural awareness requirement. It is a flipped design transformative learning course. There's a combination of active, collaborative, and experiential instructional methods and technologies that are designed to increase intercultural competence. The students participate in two weekly 50-minute lectures. Plus, in the face-to-face section, they have weekly 2-hour discussion-based lab sessions. And in the online section, they have a discussion forum that replaces the lab sections. The relevant learning outcomes that we decided to look at for this specific study was to examine one's beliefs, values, and assumptions regarding cultural differences in social group memberships and experiences, and to analyze differences in power and privilege related to social identity groups. So these were the two that we thought we could use as far as looking at the bevy specifically and the scales that are in that instrument, as far as which scales we would look at based on these two learning outcomes. The data that we used in the study was collected between spring 2019 and fall 2019 semesters. So the bevy was administered to students as a course assignment at the beginning and then at the end of each semester in both the online and face-to-face sections. In the face-to-face course, we had 210 completions for the pre-test and 171 completions for the post-test. And then the online course, we had 60 in the pre-test and 34 in the post-test. And here Chris is going to give you a little bit more information about the instrument itself and how the scales are used, a little bit more about the scales that are used, the history of the instrument, and how we use them in this study.
I just wanted to describe the instrument itself, give you a little bit of background information, and explain some of the constructs that are measured by the instrument so that you have a better way to interpret the results that you're going to be presented with. Okay, so some just background general information about the bevy. It's been around for a good number of years, a couple of decades, and it was created in a very different way from most surveys that you've probably taken. So most of the time scholars will have a model, and then they very carefully construct questions and items on a survey to reflect that model. And this survey was actually created in an opposite way, where the items came first, and then they had to explain it with a theory. They took a set of authentic statements, just statements that people came right out and said to people, and there was about 3,000 of them. And then through these statistical analyses, they whittled down that set to the 185 items that you actually took in the bevy. And the items were retained on the instrument when they gave us the power to distinguish one type of person from another type of person, or one type of belief system from another type of belief system. So there's no sort of underlying decision about which items to include because they're inherently better than other items. They're just powerful items in helping us see those interesting results. So there is a ton of data that the Bevy gives us. There's 17 different scales that are included in the Bevy data, and we don't have time to go over all of them. So you're going to get a little bit of a truncated excerpt report. But just realize that there's a lot of information here, and not only is there a lot of topics sort of covered by the Bevy, but there's a lot of different ways that we can slice and dice the data in order to find out interesting things about the groups who take it. So one of the things that I want to point out is the Bevy is not just about who you are, it's also about the interaction between who you are and what you learn. So we all know that people bring with them to the classroom, to the table, to experiences, the past lives that they've led. And so two people can have the same exact experience, but interpret it in very different ways because they're different people. And you can see that happening on the Bevy. It's really fascinating. And the second thing that I wanted to point out here, this third point where it says the instrument is neutral, that's really important for you to understand because the Bevy is not meant to judge you in any way or make you feel like one value system is better or worse than another. It's really neutral at its heart, at its core. The Bevy does not care which side of a scale you end up on. There's no evaluation there at all. But we have to be very transparent and realistic about the fact that people do have values. And so the people who use the Bevy, the researchers, the faculty members who give the Bevy to participants, probably do have some ideas about which side of the scale they would prefer people to be on or to move towards. And it's perfectly fine if you disagree about which end of the scale is better or preferable for you personally. Okay, so this next section, I'm going to talk about several different examples just to give you an idea of what the Bevy can tell us about groups and also to give you a basic foundation or understanding of what the constructs are or some of the constructs that the Bevy measures. Okay? So the first thing that the Bevy can show us is how different groups have different value systems and where those value systems come from, so between group comparisons. Okay? The data that you see here, and I'm going to blow this up so that you can see it a little bit better. So the data that you see here, it comes from 3 different institutions, and these are large numbers of students, hundreds if not thousands of students who are taking the instrument at every institution. So we have a very nice sample size here. And you see here 2 universities that are in different parts of the world and yet have strikingly similar results, at least on these last 4, 14, 15, 16, and 17 scales. And then a third university, Georgia State University, that is in a different location and also has some different contextual factors that differ from the others. And this university is strikingly different from the first 2. So let me explain just a little bit about what a couple of these scales are, and then I want you to take a second and think about how the context of where these universities are might be influencing the value systems of the students who attend those universities. So the first one we're going to talk about is number 14, gender traditionalism, and this is a scale that measures sort of how rigid or structured your sense of gender roles or gender norms is. And the higher the number there, the more structured, the more traditional, and the lower the number, the more flexible or the more loose your ideas about who men and women should be, can be, or even how many genders there are potentially. So the second one that I want you to think about, other than gender traditionalism, is number 16, ecological resonance. And this is a measure of how invested you are in environmental issues. The high end of the scale being very, very invested, very much caring about the environment, and the lower end of that scale being not very interested at all. So think about the different contexts. We've got Zamorano in Honduras, small, private. Hong Kong Baptist University in Hong Kong, small, private. Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia, very large and public. So what are those different contexts of the location and of the institution itself? could be influencing the value systems of the students who attend. One of the things that I'd like to point out to you is that there may be a difference in socioeconomic level of the students who attend a private institution as opposed to a public. So that could be one factor that's influencing why gender traditionalism and ecological resonance are different at the two private institutions as opposed to the public. There may be also something happening here with urban versus rural settings. So for example, Samarano is in a rural area. It's about an hour outside the capital, and it's a very closed campus, like literally armed guards walking around the wall that borders the campus and all the students living inside and having to get passes to leave. Georgia State, being right downtown Atlanta in the midst of all the high rises and with businesses and homeless people and all sorts of people from different walks of life mixed in with the college students, those are very different contexts that might influence not only value systems like gender traditionalism, but also ecological resonance. So if you can think about an urban campus being pretty far away from, not very connected to the natural environment in a way that Samarano, being a rural campus and exclusively an agricultural university, would probably be. Also, in an urban place like Atlanta, where Georgia State is, it's a very diverse community that has not only lots of international influences, lots of refugee communities, a very high percentage of domestic minorities, but also a very active and vibrant queer community that could be influencing ideas about and discourses about gender and what it means and how it should be performed and all of those kinds of ideas. So finally, we are going to look at a third aspect of Bevy analysis, and that's taking the same group but testing them more than once. So when you have pre-test data before an experience and post-test data after an experience, you have some really interesting information about how people are changing over time. Okay, so this is that next example of change over time. T1 and T2 just represents pre-test and post-test, and this data is from a study abroad group that went to India. It was a short-term trip over winter break. They went to India and they were taking a course on environmental issues. Now, the instructor had some very particular learning outcomes for this course related to learning more about the environment and probably, if he's honest with himself, caring more about the environment, right? So he probably would have been very thrilled about the results that you see at the bottom of the page, where in the T1, the pre-test, the students had fairly low ecological resonance, and then it skyrocketed after just a couple of weeks in this trip to India. So he would probably call that a positive change, a change in the right direction, a change in his desired direction. The first scales there, negative life events, though, is fascinating to me because this is an unexpected change that occurred as a result of this course. Negative life events, if I briefly describe this to you, has to do with how many traumatic events or troubling aspects of your life that you experienced in childhood. And it's totally subjective, right? So it's just your perception of your own childhood. 57 is pretty high for college students. College students tend to be around 30 if you look at all of the Bevy data over time. So that's a high number to start out with anyway. So that's interesting in and of itself. But even more interesting is that after a 2-week trip to India, these people evidently reevaluated their own childhood and came to a different understanding of just how many negative life events they had experienced or how traumatic that was for them. So again, not something that this professor put in his syllabus, but an interesting outcome of the study abroad program.
So as I mentioned, there were 17 scales. However, we didn't use all of them. So based on those course outcomes, the scales that we chose for this study included looking at negative life events, needs fulfillment, identity diffusion, basic determinism, emotional attunement, self-awareness, religious traditionalism, gender traditionalism, sociocultural openness, and global resonance. So these are the scales that were most focused on us being able to understand intercultural competence gains in students, as well as fulfilling the outcomes that we highlighted in the course. And just based on those course outcomes, although the bevy itself as a tool is neutral, the changes that we desire to see as far as looking at the change and saying this would be indicative of the student growing in this outcome are outlined here on this slide. So now looking at the results, what does the bevy data tell us about how social identities matter across different learning platforms? The first thing that we wanted to take a look at was the aggregate profile. So when we look at the bevy results, 5 points difference across time or between groups is considered meaningful on the 100-point normed scale. So when we're looking at these aggregate results, there aren't that many that have a 5-point difference. However, it's important to recognize that value systems are hard to change. So we would only expect to see a small shift after only one semester. And when we're looking at this bird's eye view or the whole group aggregate means, the instrument the instrument appears to be extremely reliable because there isn't much movement that we see. However, we do see small shifts towards some learning outcomes, such as some increases in sociocultural openness, which is down here, and global resonance. So sociocultural openness, a willingness to interact with culturally different others and diverse perspectives. And then a global resonance, how interested students are and active they are in being aware of global issues beyond their local communities. So looking at that, we do see some small shifts. We also do see a meaningful shift in identity diffusion. So in identity diffusion, we do see a greater than 5-point difference. And that's a measure of how settled students feel in their identities, or the confusion or anxiety of participants experience around their sense of self. So the higher the score, the more of an identity crisis that we might say that they're going through, or the less settled they feel in their identity. So we see here that the students in the face-to-face course increase in identity diffusion, while those in the online course actually show a small decrease. That increase for the face-to-face students are indicative of students feeling a bit more confused or unsettled about their identities after completing the course. Which could be a good thing in terms of a transformative learning course, since sometimes when students are going through, or really anyone is going through a worldview change, that's preceded by a feeling of disorientation that causes them to question their deeply held beliefs. However, that can also be a negative because that is a stressful experience. So that can cause a backlash in terms of learning outcomes. So looking at our findings, first we wanted to look at bimodal distributions. So we did see this across multiple scales, but the largest bimodal distributions we saw were in the realm of politics. So this is not just about the T1 to T2 change, but really being able to look at the differences that we see between students who identify as conservative and students that identify as liberal, and just how varying they are in their experiences or in their identities. So when we look at bimodal distributions, this helps us to identify what we might call fault lines along which conflict is likely to occur among students. So in a course that's highly discussion-based, this is useful information to know as far as where might these conflicts occur, or amongst which students might they occur. And politics is going to be one of those lines where we see the greatest polarization between students. That's not surprising given the current political climate that we see within our nation, but you can just imagine what type of effect that has on classroom dialogue. even if they're not explicitly talking about politics, their political orientation or outlook has an effect on how strictly they look at religion, how strictly they hold gender roles, how socioculturally open they are, how much they value environmentalism, and then even how aware they are of things that are going on outside of their local community. So it's we just took a few of the scales, but this type of polarization is seen throughout most of them. And so as you can see here, political orientation affects nearly every facet of the student's belief system. Another finding we saw were some differences based on country of origin. So when we look at negative life events, here we see that international students reevaluated their childhoods after taking the course and had their sense of identity unsettled. They also experienced a backlash effect in terms of critical thinking. All of those impacts were stronger in the online sections. So just looking at the data here as far as reevaluation of the childhood. So we see for international students, there is a large change from T1 to T2 here, and here in the online course, but reevaluating their childhood, they came out of the course perceiving themselves as having had more negative events in their formative years than they had initially thought of at the beginning of the course. We also see this identity unsettling here in both the online and face-to-face courses. And then basic determinism is what we look at to understand critical thinking. And so we can see that a higher score in basic determinism shows that shows that participants want more black and white explanations rather than having a greater room of gray area. And so we see that the scale increased, which would be indicative of less critical thinking or that backlash effect as we discussed it earlier. Domestic students had either opposite effects online or they didn't really show any effects in the face-to-face format of the course. When we look at gender, it appears that gender seemed to significantly shape how students experience the course, whether they took it online or face-to-face. There were quite a few differences in the Bevier results, and we highlighted just a few of them here. So looking at needs fulfillment, which is how fulfilled you feel in your current life, your sense of self-efficacy and satisfaction with current circumstances. We see that males increased in their perception in both environments, but more so in the face-to-face setting. The same is true for emotional attunement for males, where they became more comfortable with their own emotions as well as others' emotions. Basic openness, which is an honesty about inner thoughts and feelings, went up in the face-to-face course, but didn't change that much in the online class. For females, however, you see an opposite effect happening for males. Looking at these as a whole, we see that males achieved more cognitive learning outcomes in the online format of the course. We can see this exemplified in gender traditionalism, where males decreased in their gender traditionalism. They increased in their sociocultural openness in both sections, and then also increased in global resonance in both sections. When we look at females, on the other hand, they didn't achieve much growth in the learning outcomes in either setting and seem to experience more of a backlash in the online setting. their basic openness and emotional attunement decreased when we look at the online section of the course. And this is almost as if they were retreating from a painful emotional engagement. Their critical thinking skills were also negatively impacted, in contrast to males who decreased in basic determinism in the online course. And so we see that females and males had quite opposite experiences in some of these on some of these scales in the online and face-to-face sections of the course. So what do these results tell us? The first takeaway is that different populations of students are enrolling in online versus face-to-face courses. So this is especially especially visible when looking at the needs, the negative life events and needs fulfillment scales across the different identity groups. Some of the students showed greater levels of resilience than others in the online versus face-to-face sections. However, due to COVID, students who might not normally enroll online might be more likely to enroll online. And so one study has already found that more women are choosing online education as a result of COVID. And as we just saw on the last slide, for a course like this, it appears that the online format was actually not as helpful for females as it was for males. Additionally, some international students might be more likely to be in online courses or enroll in online courses when they may not have before because of restricted mobility. We also saw different outcomes for different students. So domestic students, white students, and male students may achieve more desired outcomes in online learning, whereas URM, international, and female students may achieve more desired outcomes and experience the course as less emotionally challenging in the face-to-face setting. So just thinking about challenging students versus supporting them, not even really versus, but kind of thinking about how we can do both. So it could be that students with more stigmatized identities find the face-to-face setting more supportive or feel more free to voice their perspectives. Meanwhile, majority students may find the online setting less overwhelming in terms of challenges to their emotional resilience and existing belief structures. Keeping in mind that too much challenge can cause a backlash effect. So it's constantly walking the line between challenging students, but supporting them enough that they still grow in learning outcomes rather than just completely putting up a wall and going in the opposite directions. It's also important to recognize that both situations, both online or face-to-face, can lead to reduced affective barriers to learning depending on how the students themselves identify. So here's a list of the references that we cited, and stay tuned for a live question and answer session. Thank you.
All right, so that was a lot of data for Dr. Eisminger to throw at us, and hopefully we've got some really great questions from those who are participating with us today so that we can dialogue about what this all means for us as instructors and how we can support students with these different identities, no matter which of these platforms, either face-to-face or online, that we're teaching in. So we'll take questions both live if you want to turn on your mic and camera and just speak directly to Dr. Eisminger, that's fine. And also, if you are more comfortable typing into chat, that is great as well. So as we wait for folks to go ahead and think about questions, I'll start with the first one. This is something Annette and I, as we were previewing the video, we were thinking it might be really helpful to have you talk, Shalise, a little bit more about the learning outcomes for the course. So returning back to, at the heart, what is this curriculum about? And so then how does that really make a difference for the identities of the students?
What was the last part of your question?
Yeah.
How does that make a difference for what?
For the identities of the students.
Yes, so yes, someone just asked, could I share an overview of the actual course? So I'll do both while I'm answering that question. So the course is called Communicating Across Cultures. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it's taught in the College of Agriculture. So it was designed in response to industry leaders in agriculture coming to the college and saying that the graduates of the college were great as far as like technical knowledge and understanding the field, but having trouble with actually interacting with and working with people of different backgrounds. And so from that, Dr. Morris was tasked with creating a course that would work to prepare students to be able to effectively interact with people from different backgrounds. That's another way of saying develop intercultural competence, so to effectively and appropriately be able to interact with people across cultures. So that's a short overview, or a short overview of the history. As far as the actual class, it meets twice a week for 50-minute lecture sections. And then they have a discussion-based lab section once a week that's close to 2 hours in length. However, for the online course, in place of the lab section, they have discussion forums that they engage with. So the learning outcomes, I guess I can read all of them to you since we just kind of had two highlighted. But the first one is to examine one's beliefs, values, and assumptions regarding cultural differences and social group memberships and experiences. So that's really hitting on students being able to grow in self-awareness and understanding their own experiences, recognizing that they have a cultural lens that they're viewing the world through. But then also learning that everyone doesn't share that cultural lens, so that other groups of students or other groups of people have different cultural lenses that they're seeing the world through. The next one is to define the basics of culture. So once again, hitting on the idea that all people have a culture, what that means, how that shapes your interactions. Describe the categories of discrimination and their effects as the next learning outcome. So understanding bias, stereotypes, prejudice, what discrimination actually is. They learn about workplace discrimination in the course. The next one is to examine cultural differences in verbal and nonverbal communication within multicultural interactions and settings. So really focusing on communicating. And then the other one that we'd highlighted was analyze differences in power and privilege related to social identity groups, but not limited, or for example, but not limited to race, gender, ethnicity, nationality, age, language, citizenship, religion, class, sexual orientation, or physical ability. So we have weeks that cover each of those sections or each of those social identities, where students learn more about some of the history of those social groups, what discrimination looks like as far as those groups and how they face it, what legal protections are available, what legal protections are not available. So that gives an overview of the course. And then Chris, you'd asked how the outcomes relate to the student identities.
Yeah, like more the findings of the previous papers that you've published.
Yes, so in the previous paper we found, let me see if I have that written down. Yes, so we found in the previous paper that we did on this, we only looked at face-to-face students, so we didn't include online, but we looked at country of origin, gender, ethnicity, political affiliation, and religiosity, and how those related to, or how students' identities in each of those groups related to the student outcomes. So we found that similar to in this study, that white students, male students, and I think it was religious students and conservative students. So that group really struggled in the face-to-face course as far as having a backlash effect, not really being at the end of the course where we'd hope to see them as far as what the student outcomes were. So then it's interesting, in this one we didn't look at religiosity, But it's interesting in this study that we see that white students, male students, and I think it was conservative students actually did better in the online section of the course than they did in the face-to-face section, which is similar to what we found in the last study. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. And I just want to add for participants that we always put a collection in the Hubbicle along with these recordings of the webinars. And so for this particular collection, we can put these previous publications that Shalise is talking about, but also all the references that she has cited and the syllabus of AGR 201 for folks who wanted to take a closer look at the course. Okay, so we have some questions coming up in chat. So Catherine Ingvi is asking a question, basically saying that she was surprised to see that underrepresented students didn't have a more positive experience in the online course. So she was wondering if that sort of was what you expected to see, or if you were surprised as well.
I wasn't super surprised, just because in the literature in online classes, it's been very mixed as far as findings of safety for students in general. Like, some people assume that everyone would feel safer in an online class because of the anonymity, that's a hard word to say, because of the anonymous nature of the course, or perceived anonymous nature. The findings in the literature around online courses has been mixed. Sometimes students find it to be more safe. Sometimes students find it to be more challenging. So it wasn't super surprising. In this case, for this course, we found that underrepresented students found the face-to-face section to be safer for them than the online setting. I think further study we'd have to do further studies to find out what the reason is behind that. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. There's another question in the chat from Samuel, and it says, do you have a sense for hybrid teachers of what the conclusions represent for the question of challenging versus supporting students? That is, whether we should feel more comfortable pushing students on identity questions in person and take more care to be supportive for online classes, or vice versa, or just what is your advice there?
That's a good question. Question of challenging versus supporting students, whether you pushing students on questions in person and take care to be more supportive of online classes. I think, so I guess I want to say that I would take the findings of the study in combination with you getting to know your own class and working from there. So kind of using this as a starting point of thinking, hey, maybe this is something I should be cautious of, or look into or be aware of, that this could be a possibility. But then really, as you get to know your students, how are they faring as far as if you are pushing identity questions in person or in face-to-face and then doing something else online. I think you could also potentially conduct the bevy for your own course, because that would give you an idea of where your specific students are, as far as you'd then be able to have a snapshot of, like, maybe what are those red flags or those fault lines that may be present in your own course, if that makes sense. Because of the findings that we had in this study, it was kind of like, it would be hard to say take one approach in person and a different approach online, because we saw differences between the students. So you would have to essentially try and like split your class in half and say, okay, I'm going to push the white male students online, but then the face-to-face class, then I'll challenge the underrepresented students more. I think that would be a challenge, as well as it might get you into a very tricky situation. The other issue is that it's difficult to account for intersectionality in the way that the results are presented here by the bevy. And so, like, you might have a white student who, according to these results, would do better in the online class, but then if they're a female, they would do better in the face-to-face course. So it's really going to depend on what it looks like in your specific situation. I hope that answers your question, Samuel.
I think that was really helpful. I have a little bit of a follow-up question to that. Do you think that there's any impact on these results in the level of involvement of the instructor or facilitator? So for example, if you're having a discussion in class and people are sort of dialoguing, is there more presence felt of the instructor as opposed to a discussion board online where even if the instructor is there, maybe that presence is more hidden, they're not as involved in contributing to that conversation, or they may not even be monitoring as closely as if they were there in the room?
Hmm. Yeah, it's definitely a possibility. I mean, instructor presence is a big thing in online learning. And so if students aren't perceiving the instructor's presence, then they're going to have a very different experience with the course than if they are. An instructor presence wouldn't just be limited to like the discussion board, but like how often are they actually interacting with or engaging with the instructor makes a big difference in how students walk away from the course. And that's something that we didn't actually look at in this specific study.
Yeah. All right, so there's another question in chat about the political differences. If you can just speak a little bit to, was there some intentionality in how those political differences were managed in the course or in the dialogues?
So thinking. For the time that the data was collected, was I teaching this class? But in general, so we try to, as far as political, I guess political leanings, generally the feedback from the course or for the course is that the course pushes a very liberal perspective from the conservative students in the class. We don't generally bring like current politics into the course unless it's something that's like super relevant to the course material that's being presented, because we don't want to be like put in a position of we were trying to like politically indoctrinate students or discriminating against students because of their political affiliation. So like we don't collect that information from the students. In the bevy, they put it in there, but it's not like reported back to us who identifies as conservative, who identifies as liberal. And then if you look at the numbers on that, there are a lot of students that select independent in the course, and so they're not actually shown in those results. But I guess how we try to manage that is really just keeping the focus on the course materials, unless like the students bring it up, because they do have a current events assignment that they do, but then it's a student-led discussion in that case, so that it's not the instructors like leading one way or another as far as a political leaning.
Yeah. And one thing that comes to mind too for me is that because we return the bevy results to the students, I mean, they get their individual reports, but they also get a group debriefing. And we talk about that. We talk about how the politics seems to be the point of most polarization in the class. So at least it's on their radar as in conversations, we have to be careful. We need to show each other some grace. We need to be aware that that's underneath the surface, even if it's not being explicitly talked about.
Something else that we do just at the beginning of the class is we do have this discussion about guidelines for course discussions, that we involve the students in creating those guidelines. And then if those guidelines get broken, we bring those up throughout the semester.
Is there, I'm thinking about the syllabus, and there's a question on here about, as you're talking about all these different social identities, and you talk about gender and sexuality and class and race, is there one on linguistic identity? I don't remember.
There's not. Students can do linguicism as a part of their semester-long cultural immersion project, like as a topic, but we don't have a week that covers that specifically.
All right, so very interesting question from Elisa. When you see that backlash actually happening, during the semester, we see this now in T1, T2 results, so we have evidence that it has happened, but sometimes we can see it playing out in discussions in the classroom as we're involved with the students. Do you have any techniques for managing backlash in the moment as you're seeing it happening?
Yeah, so I think usually, as far as from my experience, the times that I've seen this happen in person, it will be a student will just shut down and not engage in the discussion anymore if it's a specific discussion, or they'll just stop engaging in the course. However, that's also a challenge because some of our students already come into the class disengaged, and so it's like, or they just appear to be disengaged. Sometimes I've been surprised by students, like they just sit there straight-faced, not really participating, but then like by the end of the class, like they're like, oh, this was a great course, these are all the things I learned. Like or like in the reflections you could see they're actually thinking about it. So I think when it's not the case of like it's just a student with a really good poker face, if they're just shutting down, I think one of the things that I've done in the past is I'll email a student if I realize like that they felt that maybe the whole class was against them, and thank them for their contribution to the course, encourage them to continue contributing, because I think it is important for them to have a voice as well, even if it's an opinion that a lot of their peers don't agree with, because I think it's healthy for all of the students to be challenged in their beliefs. I think where it's more challenging is in the online section, because in the discussion boards, sometimes they become echo chambers. And so in that case, then I'm not sure like if people are just writing down what they think I want to hear, or what they think their peers want to hear, or if they're all just really thinking the same things, which is unlikely. And so oftentimes I try to play devil's advocate and just bring in different ideas or contrary thoughts. One, to challenge the students who haven't thought of that, but two, for students to feel safer in bringing an unpopular opinion up if they are concerned about doing that.
I know that Dr. Morris has talked at times about the difficulty of being an instructor of color teaching a course like this. Do you feel sometimes as the instructor a backlash against you in particular, like you have some sort of agenda and you're browbeating students? Do you ever get that kind of a backlash?
Yes. Usually it comes up in the student evaluations. What I try to do most often is decentering myself, and focusing on the experiences of others, the experiences of the students, the experiences of guest speakers. I use things such as YouTube videos, etc., bringing in as many different voices so that it's not just this is my experience or my single experience. One, because I don't want students just walking away saying, well, that was her one experience, and so not everyone else is not like this. But two, to try and I guess move the target away from myself and help them to focus on their ideas and reflect on their own beliefs and values and where those came from, because I think that if I can get them to become at least more self-aware of where did this belief come from, then that's helpful.
Yeah. I know in the last paper that you published on this data, you talked about self-determination theory. Can you talk a little bit now about how that plays into it and how that might help backlash or prevent or address backlashes? Like if students have more self-determination in the course?
Yeah, so we actually talked about that in this paper as well as in another one that we were writing about the course, and just really helping the students to take ownership of their own learning and experience. One, I think that helps them to engage more, but two, most of the students, if you ask them, why did you take this course, their response is because it was required or because my advisor told me to. And so their motivation in the class to begin with is pretty low to start out with. The reasoning behind that is varied. Some find it irrelevant, others think that because they've already experienced so much of the world that they don't need a course like this. And so the student experiences with diversity also vary. But in the end, many of the, or only a few of the students take the course because they were truly interested in it. And so if we can try and help them to, one, see the relevance of the course, but then also help them to feel more engaged, that's been shown in the literature to increase motivation for learning, increase experiences in the course, and increase student outcomes, like as walking away from the course as having learned the material that you were aiming for them to learn.
Excellent. Thank you so much for doing this for us, Dr. Eisminger. We really appreciate your insight on this particular course, but also as it applies to many other courses as they move back and forth from face-to-face to online in this crazy world that we're living in. And I'm going to turn it back over to Annette now to wrap up our webinar series.
Thank you so much for each of you for joining us today, and especially to those of you who have attended so many of these webinar sessions. All of the videos for this webinar series can be found curated for a limited time at the URL where you first came into this webinar series. So at purdue.edu, IPPU, Sylmar Learning Virtual ICL. However, we have plans to repurpose that website soon and add more pages to it, and so the URL may change. So you might want to know that all of the videos for this webinar are more permanently curated into the Intercultural Learning Hub at hubicl.org/publications. If you're looking for all of those resources that we put out there on the webpage, they are in a collection. So if you go to hubical.org members 1005, that's my number, collections, Purdue Virtual ICL Webinar Series, you'll find everything that we've offered on the web pages. Please like and follow us at facebook.com/Purdue Sylmar, because that's how you'll find out whenever we come back off hiatus and offer more sessions. If you have questions or comments, please don't hesitate to contact us at sylmar@purdue.edu. Thanks so much.